Can I just mention that it's been mentioned to me during the break that I should remind anyone who wants to use their services that the Red Cross are here and available should anyone need their help.
So
yes.
I understand the technical problems have been resolved, but before I ask you to look at the document, Prime Minister, I just want to go back to what I was asking you just before the break about the question of priorities. Ms Mordaunt, in her capacity as Leader of the House, when she gave evidence to the inquiry on Monday, said this: "We're about to go into the fourth and final session of legislation. I know that's going to be a short session and there are carryover bills. Whilst there are policy areas still to be resolved and not questions that I can answer on that, but what I can tell you is that in terms of this government and this Prime Minister's priorities going into that fourth session, this is one of his priorities." Now, the Leader of the House has responsibilities, we understand it, for planning and supervising the government's legislative programme, amongst other things.
Yes, that is one of their priorities and responsibilities, yes.
And from your knowledge of the government's legislative programme and plans, was Ms Mordaunt right to say that this was is one of your priorities?
Yes, as I said before, I hope people can take away from the actions of the government since I've been Prime Minister that we are making progress in resolving the years of injustice on this issue and bringing people the redress and recognition that they rightly deserve. And it will continue to be a priority, and that will continue to be a focus for me and the government.
Now, I want to turn to the specific question of interim payments. Can I ask you to look at JEVA 40258? So this is a Sunday Times article from the 31st of July 2022. So it's, I think, at the time of the Conservative Party leadership contest, and it refers to the then two Tory leadership hopefuls, Ms Truss and yourself, and says that you had both called for interim payments to be made to the victims of one of the worst disasters in NHS history. I won't read what Ms Truss said, but then what you're recorded as saying is this: "The contaminated blood scandal is a tragic injustice, and we must now match words with action, just as we did with those affected by the thalidomide scandal. Survivors and their families need to have certainty now, so I'd ensure the interim compensation payments recommended by Sir Brian Langstaff are paid without delay." Now, just so that we understand the reference to the thalidomide scandal, am I right in understanding that to be a reference to an announcement you made in March 2021, when as Chancellor you pledged lifetime funding, funding that had otherwise been due to run out this year, saying that the thalidomide victims deserve better than to have constant uncertainty? Is that what that refers to?
I believe so.
And then the reference to matching words with action and the need for survivors and their families to have certainty now. Would you stand by those words today?
Yeah, well, they referred very specifically, so it's important not to take them out of context. They referred very specifically to the recommendations that were made in the interim report about interim compensation payments of £100,000 paid to those who were already part of the support schemes, and indeed that was delivered in full, as I said, days after I became Prime Minister.
Yes, it was announced, I think, by the then Prime Minister on the 17th of August.
Yes.
So within 3 weeks of the first interim report recommendation on interim payments, the government took a decision and acted. Now, you will know, I'm sure, that amongst the other recommendations in the inquiry's second interim report is a recommendation for interim payments to be made to a cohort of individuals who did not receive the interim payments made last year. So the interim payments made last year were in relation to survivors, those who were infected who still live, and to bereaved partners and widows. Those whose children died, those whose parents died, have never benefited from the financial support schemes and never received any compensation. And they are the focus of one of the Chair's recommendations, and a recommendation for interim payments now. If we look at JEVA 40276, please, just to provide some further context to this issue. This is a letter sent by, I think, some campaigners to you at the beginning of this week. I don't know whether it reached you through your ordinary offices, but I know the inquiry has forwarded it on to you. If we could just go further down the page, please, Lawrence. Yes, so I just want to pick it up with the paragraph beginning, our journey. Our journey has been marked by immeasurable pain and loss. So Brian Langstaff's done commendable work in putting forth recommendations that offer a fair resolution. However, these recommendations still need to be fulfilled, our pleas echoing in what seems to be an empty hall. The appointment of the ALB's chair remains to be made. This delay denies victims and their families any tangible sense of progress. Many continue to die without seeing full redress. This cannot be right. And then it's the next issue that I want to explore with you, Prime Minister. The interim payment for deaths not yet recognised is critical. These payments are not just about compensation. They symbolise acknowledgement, and they represent initial recognition of each life lost. We know, for example, that many of the 380 children infected with HIV died in childhood, and their deaths remain unrecognised. Now, before I ask you, and I'm sorry this is a long introduction to a question, but before I ask you the question, I'm going to ask you to look at something in the Chair's second interim report about the position of children whose parents died and parents whose children died. So if we could have, please, Lawrence, INQY 40453, and if we could go, please, to page 7, I think. I'm going to pick it up at the bottom of the page, the last paragraph, and then over to the next page. Colin was around a year old when he was given factor concentrate. At about 2.5, he was diagnosed with HIV. His parents, Colin and Janet Smith, gave evidence to the inquiry. His mother said he loved school, but he became too ill to go, really. I mean, sometimes he'd just say, I think I want to go to school today, and we'd put him in a wheelchair, wrap him up, and we'd get him literally to the door, and then he'd say, I want to go home now. His father recalled, I lost my job because the boss was scared of people finding out and losing customers. So within a week, I got another job. I thought, and if we can go over the page, I thought I'd take a night shift job. Nobody around, nobody would know me, but the day I was going to start, he called me into the office and said he couldn't start me. So from that point on, I was basically unemployable. I went to the job centre, they wouldn't let me sign on. Colin died aged 7. His father said there's no way a child should have to die the way he did. It wasn't pleasant. It still affects us now. And it's not just our son, there's lots of children have had to go through that. I could cope with death, but not with the death of my son. I still have trouble today, the fact that he's in a grave on his own and the guilt will never go away. And then just one further passage, if I may, Prime Minister. It's the next one. Susan. Susan's 2 sons, I should say, were infected with HIV and died in childhood of AIDS. Susan, mother of Brian and Stephen, gave evidence to the inquiry. You think what might have been. I can only still see them as 9 and 16. But it's Christmas. A couple of weeks ago, it was Brian's birthday, but Christmas we put flowers on. And right after Christmas, it's Stephen's birthday. In the February, so more flowers. Then in May, it's Brian's anniversary. Then in September, it's Brian's birthday. And then in October, it's Stephen's anniversary. And pausing there, the anniversary she refers to is the anniversary of their deaths. And then we're back to Christmas again. And it doesn't matter how many years go by, you're still asking why? And I keep going to the grave and I keep saying, sometimes I think they're not there, they're going to walk in. I just think, no, it can't be. Why? I just want someone to tell me why. It won't bring them back. I just want them back so much. I just ache for them to come back. You can't get on with your life. I just ache. I think it's like a heartache. Your heart is aching so much. Your whole body aches. I'm just mentally and physically tired, I think. I just want them back and I can't. Now, those are just 2 examples, Prime Minister, as I'm sure you understand, of the groups of individuals whose deaths have, and whose continuing suffering have never been measured or recognised through financial support or compensation. And they are some of those whose suffering would be recognised if interim payments were made. As you've told us, it took only a short period of time for the first lot of interim payments to be made. But nearly 4 months down the line from the recommendation in relation to interim payments to people who've never received anything, there is still no action on the part of the government. Is there any good reason, having regard to what you said last summer in relation to the first lot of interim payments, is there any good reason for the government delaying in taking a decision on the question of interim payments for these people?
I think the first thing I'd say is I have 2 young children, and I can't imagine the loss that Brian and Stephen's mother felt and Colin's parents felt, and as you said, there's hundreds more like that from everything we know, each one a tragedy for every one of those families, and it's heartbreaking to read it again and listen to it again as I've done previously. And they are absolutely uppermost in mine and everyone else's thoughts. With regard to what might happen in terms of future compensation, obviously that is one of the many recommendations in the report, and that is subject to ongoing government decision-making and policy-making, which is why it's difficult for me to speculate further or go into more detail about what may or may not happen in that regard. But of course that work is ongoing. Questions of scope are important. There are significant questions that need to be answered as part of resolving this overall scandal and how best to do it. But because it relates to decisions that haven't been yet made, obviously there's not much more I can add to that.
Would you agree that the longer it's going to take for the government to reach conclusions about a compensation scheme overall, whether that's waiting for the final report, putting through primary legislation, appointing people, whatever it might be, the longer it's going to take, the greater importance there may be to the government considering further interim payments for those who've never received them, or indeed further interim payments for those who have. Is that something that government understands, that there's a relationship between how long you're going to take to set everything up and perhaps taking some interim measures now?
Yeah, again, Ms. Richards, for all the reasons that I've outlined, because all these matters are subject to ongoing government policy making and deliberation where final decisions haven't been made, I can't, and it wouldn't be appropriate to comment or speculate on what may or may not happen in the active considerations of government. But as I said, many people have been affected by this scandal over many decades, and an important part of resolving the scandal that is contaminated blood will be working through those issues of scope and eligibility. But as we've seen from the different reports that have been done, indeed there are some points of divergence on that particular question between people who have looked at this, the inquiry's first interim report and Robert Francis' report. It's important that those things are worked through because they obviously are particularly important.
I won't press you further on this question of interim payments for now, but would just leave with a similar invitation to the invitation I made in relation to the position of waiting for a final report. An invitation, which I leave without asking you to commit to it, for the government to think hard about the position of interim payments, particularly if through its own work that it can't tell us about, any final compensation scheme is still some way off in the future. I'm going to turn next as a topic to the question of transparency and openness. Now, you referred, Prime Minister, in some of your early remarks to part of the background events in question. So you will know that those who were infected were, for the most part, not told of the risks of their treatment. You will know that many were not told that they had been infected. You will know that when they turned to the government and elsewhere for answers, they were told for years they'd had the best available treatment, they were rebuffed. Phrases such as bad luck have been used. They feel as though they've been kept in the dark for years about what happened. And as a result, as I'm sure you'll appreciate, trust in government is fragile on the part of those infected and affected. And they feel they are still being kept in the dark because of not knowing what's going to happen in relation to compensation. And that in itself is a further source of distress and anger and trauma. Is that something that the government understands and has at the forefront of its collective mind when taking its decisions? That the fact that people still have no idea about what's going to happen in itself is capable of causing further harm?
I think, as I said right at the outset, people have been waiting for answers not just for months, not just for years, but for decades. And I talked about the layers of injustice because there really have been layers of it, not just the fact that this happened to someone, but the fact that it impacted their family, the fact that they were lied to for so many years about what had happened, and told everything was fine, nothing to see here, when that clearly wasn't the case. And then when they sought answers, sought an inquiry, they were rebuffed for many years until the inquiry was established. And as I acknowledged, this hurt and the suffering isn't just historic, it is continuing today. I acknowledge and understand all of that and sympathise with it.
Mr. Quinn told the House in December 2022, and I think again this year, that he hoped to ensure that those infected and affected were kept fully apprised of the progress that was being made. Now that hasn't happened. If it had, it maybe this hearing wouldn't have been necessary. So those infected and affected have not been given anything other than the information we have about progress being made, working at pace, hoping to achieve things as quickly as possible. I'm not again asking for details of government policy here, Mr. Sunak, but has the government considered, to your knowledge, whether, even if it can't give full details of what it's thinking about at this stage, whether there are any commitments in principle, for example, it could give, so that if there are things still to be worked out, it can give some reassurances publicly to those infected and affected, rather than saving it all up for one announcement at the end.
I think I'll point you back to what I said earlier about the right and proper way to deal with this is to work through the issues thoroughly, which is happening already in government, as the MCO has explained in detail when he was here and in his evidence, and the track record of the government under my leadership to make significant progress on these issues, both with the interim payments and the acceptance of the moral case for compensation and the work that has been done. And again, as soon as government receives a final report, that will help move the process forward even further.
Would you agree that it wouldn't be acceptable for those infected and affected to find out any information about the government's decision-making from the media, rather than directly from the government?
I mean, I think in general, the Minister for Cabinet Office has been in Parliament, which would be ordinarily the right place to do this, and for the government to be held accountable, where I think he's made at least 2 different statements and participated in at least one debate as on top of the various meetings he's had, including one at least, I believe, with various people involved in the APPG on this particular issue, as well as having met with those chairs. So those are all the various channels of normal parliamentary scrutiny of the government, which I think are functioning and working well, and there's many different ways for people to hold their members of parliament to account, and indeed the government in all the appropriate ways that we have in this country.
Yes, Prime Minister, my question was not suggesting that there's any impropriety in announcements being made in Parliament at all. My question was about the media. Can we look at RLIT 0002137, please? So this is an article in the Financial Times. Can we zoom in on the... Thank you, Lawrence. So you will see there's reference in the first paragraph, I'm looking at the left-hand column, to a suggestion that a compensation bill could reach 10 billion, according to officials, in a further blow to the UK's stretched public finances. Then there's reference to the acceptance of the moral case. And then fourth paragraph, government officials have told the Financial Times that the compensation scheme might cost 5 billion to 10 billion pounds. There's then reference to the tight nature of public finances, to discussions between Treasury officials and Department of Health officials. We're working through the options, said one government insider. Another official added, people are very worried about the cost. So that's one article, and then there's a second article, if we can just look at it, RLIT 0002136. It's to similar effect, except now the figure that's given is quadruple or double, depending which end of the scale you take, than the previous article. There's reference to ministers, this is the second paragraph in the left-hand column, examining financial modelling, which places the upper forecast for total compensation to those infected with HIV and hepatitis C and their loved ones at the mid-20 billions. There's reference to concern in Whitehall, to ministers not knowing where the money is coming from, with the compensation at present completely unfunded, the Telegraph has been told. Now, those articles contain information that hadn't been shared with Parliament, hadn't, most importantly for these purposes, been shared with those infected and affected. There may be three possibilities that occurred to me in relation to how these articles came to contain this information. Leaks from civil servants without ministerial knowledge, approval or encouragement within one or more government department. Leaks with ministerial knowledge, government or encouragement within one or more government departments, or the journalists simply making it up. Do you know if there has been any investigation within government to establish which of those three it is, or whether there is any other explanation?
I don't, to my knowledge, I'm not sure of any particular investigation that has happened on that particular issue, but as I think everyone would probably understand, much as I would love to be able to control whether anyone leaking information from government, that is not something that I can do. We do on occasion initiate leak investigations, but it's very hard, as people know, to ultimately track down sources of leaks from government. But my general view is, of course, people shouldn't leak from government. I would certainly not authorise any of that, didn't authorise any of that. And as I said, if it was possible to know who would do it, then of course I would take action. But
well, my question to you, next question is, should there be an investigation? And can I explain why I put that question to you, Prime Minister? Because it might be said that if this was consciously being leaked by government, whether it's civil servants or ministers or both, it might suggest a strategy on the part of government to try and get the public and media on its side, or on the side of government inaction or rejection of some of the recommendations. And that would be wholly wrong. I'm sure you would agree if that were the position. I'm not suggesting to you it is. We just don't know. Do you now think, looking at that there should be an investigation?
Again, it's not something I would speculate or comment on how the government conducts leak inquiries, because they're necessarily sensitive, and the last thing you would do is tell people you're about to do so. But as I said, there's an established set of procedures in place that we have.
I'm going to just end with a few more general questions, Prime Minister. And I want to take you first of all to a passage which I think I asked Ms Mordaunt about as well. It's RLIT 302074. This is Parliament, 25th of April 2017, and it's Andy Burnham giving, I think, his last speech in Parliament and choosing to do it on the subject of infected blood. If we could go a little further down the page, please, Lawrence. I can find the right passage. Yes. The second paragraph, it's the end of that, where Mr. Burnham talks about there having been goodwill on both sides of the House, a sense that people wanted to do something to help. That continued in the early part of this Parliament with a sense building that something was going to be done. However, following those expectations, victims now feel that they've been led up to the top of the hill only to be let down once again. And then if we go to the very bottom of the page, please, Lawrence. No, I can't find the reference I had in mind. It's a reference in any event to government's failure to back what had been Mr. Cameron's apology with substantial action having left people feeling in the wilderness all over again.
It's the paragraph message.
Oh, I'm grateful both to you, sir, and to Lawrence for finding that. So Mr. Burnham went on to call for the payment of compensation now, later on in the debate, as I'm sure you know. Now that's over 6 years ago. Do you understand, Prime Minister, does the government understand that with all these years having gone by and 16 months having elapsed since Sir Robert delivered his study to the government, that many victims of the infected blood disaster feel, as Mr. Burnham described them there, that they've been led up to the top of the hill only to be let down again, that they feel in the wilderness all over again because of the lack of any announcement or action on the issue of compensation?
Well, I think subsequent to that, the former Prime Minister did do something that people had been calling for many, many years, if not decades, which was a public inquiry. And that was established, I believe, after that debate happened, something that was a huge source of, rightly, a source of grievance for people, because they wanted answers, they wanted them thoroughly investigated, they didn't have confidence in, particularly the Department for Health, to do it, and they had been rebuffed for years, if not decades. Many people in this room, I'm sure, were part of those calling for an inquiry. That inquiry was established. It was announced, I think, the same year as that debate, probably relatively shortly thereafter. It started its work months after that, and obviously that inquiry's work is still ongoing. And during that period, interim payments have most recently been made, and the moral case for compensation has been accepted. So compared to when those statements were made, clearly there has been progress. Is there more to do? Absolutely, I recognise that. But given one of the, as far as I understand it at the time, very significant demands of people, rightly, were for there to be independent inquiry established to examine this issue of compensation and everything else. That has been done. Now, the inquiry's work has perhaps taken longer than people anticipated or expected, but it's right that that work is done thoroughly, and that is ongoing. And as I said, the interim report, the recommended interim compensation payments, has been acted on swiftly since then, and the moral case for compensation has been accepted. Again, I'm not well placed to say, because at that period of time, this is not something that I would have had intimate knowledge of, but those are significant developments since that debate happened.
Obviously, things have been done. You've recognised that that doesn't mean that there aren't still very important things that have been currently left unaddressed. Are you able to give any reassurance about timescales? Because we have had reference certainly since March 2022 or thereabouts to working at pace. But that doesn't tell us what the pace is. We have had the phrase "as soon as possible" referred to, with Mr. Ellis, the then Paymaster General, telling Parliament in mid-2020 that the government's response would be published as soon as possible. Those are words, mantras potentially, that don't necessarily have much content unless you can be more specific. So is there any reassurance you can give to those listening about timescales?
I think what guides me is, as we had this conversation earlier, I think the chair's description of when he was describing the work of this inquiry was to move as quickly as thoroughness allowed. I think that is a descriptor for how this inquiry has done its work, and I actually think that is the right phrase.
I think I use the phrase reasonable thoroughness, because you could be too thorough.
I think the point is well made and similar, but I think that is a good guide, not just for this inquiry's work, but for how government should behave, given the scale and complexity and significance of this issue. And as I said, the inquiry has, the fact that this issue is one that is of such a magnitude and complexity and impact to so many people has taken the inquiry this number of years to get to this point, I think demonstrates all the things that I just said. And my commitment is that government will act in the same way, to act as quickly as thoroughness allows. And what I don't want to do is add, as I've said, to the years, if not decades, of dashed and false hope and dashed expectations by putting an arbitrary timescale on something, that I'd rather be honest with people that what is guiding me is the same principle that guides the chair in his work for this inquiry.
To clarify, I'm certainly not asking for an arbitrary timetable. Mr. Quinn told us that there had been an internal deadline, and we've seen it from documents, which was of May of this year, for the work to be completed on our compensation framework. That obviously was not met. Are there internal deadlines? I'm not asking what they are for current purposes, but are there, as a matter of fact, internal deadlines to which the government is working?
I don't believe that there is a specific month-date deadline, because people are working, as I said, as quickly as possible through all the various issues to find resolution on them in preparation for the inquiry's final report to be made.
Ms. Mordaunt told the House earlier this year, not long ago I think, this. She said, "It may fall to us in this place on our shift to put that right, but we must put it right. There is not just the original injustice that was done to these people, many of whom were children at the time, but the further layers of injustice that have happened with regard to their financial resilience, as many of them lost their homes and were not able to work, facing the appalling stigma and hardship that came with that. We have to put that right." Would you accept, as Prime Minister, as leader of the current government, that if the acknowledgement of a moral case for compensation is not followed by action in providing compensation, then you are not putting it right?
Of course, action will be taken. That's why considerable work is being done, and that's why the government under my leadership accepted the moral case for compensation and started intensive work to make sure it was in a position to act on those words.
And are you able to tell us unequivocally that this government, your government, is committed to the payment of compensation to those infected and affected, even if you cannot yet tell us the form and scope of the scheme?
Again, of course that's the case, demonstrated by the fact that the government, under my leadership, honoured the interim compensation payments that have been agreed previously, made sure they were paid in a matter of days, and has continued to do extensive work, as the Minister for the Cabinet Office evidence will have demonstrated to people. That's not the work of a government that isn't committed to acting on this issue.
Mr. Hancock, having told the inquiry in his capacity as a government minister that if the inquiry recommended compensation, the government would pay compensation, can those listening take it that this government is not intending to renege on that commitment?
Again, because no final decisions have been made, factually that remains the case. As a just matter of constitutional principle, no final decisions have been made on compensation. So that's a statement of fact. You know, is my view that compensation is likely to be paid? Of course that's my view, and that's why we accepted the moral case for compensation. That's why the work is ongoing in government to think through all the questions about how and who and when and all those things that were raised in the interim report. But as a matter of fact, obviously that final decision has not been made.
A number of those infected and affected fear that through the length of time that has taken so far, the absence of any information about what the government might be planning, the decision to await the final report, the inability to give a timescale, they fear that this is something which is going to be kicked off into the long grass and potentially then lost in the complexities of a general election. And I'm just going to, if I may, Prime Minister, just read a couple of statements, observations made by core participants in advance of this hearing. One core participant said this: "What's the use? I could be dead soon and never see my compensation. They're just hanging it out for us all to die and they won't have to pay. Sorry, it's how I feel at the moment." And then another: "All I would say, as we all know, we've waited long enough for this to be settled. Surely even the government must agree that over 40 years is more than enough in anyone's mind. The longer the government drag this on, the more individuals are dying and suffering, and we've suffered more than enough." Now, I just give those as examples to show the strength of fear and concern about this getting kicked off into the long grass, with people continuing to die, people continuing to struggle financially and emotionally. Is there anything else that you feel able to say, Prime Minister, that would provide any form of reassurance to enable those listening to regain confidence that justice will be done without undue delay?
Yes, the reassurance I hope people would take is that, as the comments you mentioned talked about, decades of waiting. Decades and decades of waiting for action, for recognition. And since I've been Prime Minister, which is just 8 and a bit months, we have seen interim compensation payments made to 4,500 people, a significant sum of £100,000. We have seen the moral case for compensation accepted for the first time in those 30 or 40 years. And we have seen, I think, a level of intensity of work on all the questions surrounding compensation that has not happened before, as far as I'm aware, in government, although no doubt your other evidence will demonstrate that. So that is the reassurance that I hope people will take away. Yes, I completely understand. People have been waiting for a long time. People are waiting for redress, waiting for recognition. That's entirely right and reasonable that they are, and they want it to happen as soon as possible. I share those sympathies. I also want to see that, and I'm determined to work as quickly as thoroughness allows to find resolution on all these issues. And the actions of my government over the last 8 months in the context of those 40 years should show people that we are making progress towards that goal.
So those are the questions I'm proposing to ask the Prime Minister, but obviously we will need to take a break. I'm sorry it's taken rather longer, particularly with the technical break. We will need to take a break to allow core participants to suggest any further questions arising out of the oral evidence that they would wish me to consider.
Now, how long a break do you think we might need?
Well, 20 minutes minimum, 20 minutes to 30 minutes.
Shall we say half an hour? I hope that's not inconveniencing you too much, Prime Minister, but we'll come back, shall we, at 25 to 5. If there's any further delay on that, it'll be for good reason and you'll be told. And I can't promise you how long you'll be detained once we come back. It all depends upon the questions that are asked and the answers and so on. But for the moment, if everyone just remains in their seat, you can leave us and come back at 25 to 5. Thank you.